we're intermingling.
Oh, well, I'll have Imogen first because she's going to do the lovely Tasmania Aboriginal.
So we acknowledge the Tasmanian Aboriginal people as the traditional custodians of this land, and we pay our respects to elders, past and present and future, who hold the memories, traditions, culture and hope of Tasmania's First Peoples. Libraries Tasmania also pays respect to the resilience and strength of the Tasmanian Aboriginal people and extends that respect to all First Australian peoples. So thank you everyone for having us today. The two of us are going to be swapping back and forth. We've both got sections within this, so bear with us as we jump back and forth between us. And we're going to talk today about using context and circumstance in family history, and that will become a little bit clearer as we go on. In the middle of last year, a scandal seized the historical world. An upcoming book by a well-known author had significant factual errors. The book was Outrages by Naomi Wolf, a journalist and former political advisor, and it was focused on the criminalisation of male same-sex relationships in 19th century Britain. Before publication, it was heralded as being groundbreaking. Wolf made new claims about men being executed for sodomy during this time, based on a search through court records for men with the note, "Death Recorded." The only problem is that there's no evidence that any men were executed for sodomy in Britain. Wolf had misunderstood some basic details on these men's files. Death Recorded did not indicate execution, nor did sodomy exclusively refer to homosexual acts. Death Recorded, in fact, meant the judge had recommended a pardon from a death sentence. So all of these men had lived beyond their court appearances. The response was immediate. Publication was delayed and then cancelled. Historians of the 19th century exploded with their outrage, and debate roared across the internet. For them, this was an affront to their expertise. These were not complicated mistakes, but a failure to understand a fundamental element of the legal system. The definition of death recorded could be found in a range of research. Her mistake was put down to laziness and a notorious thirst for sensationalism. Now, why am I telling you this story? It's not to demoralise you or to put the fear of making mistakes into you. Naomi Wolf was already on thin ice with many academics, and this was a classic story of pride coming before a fall. But it is a lesson in researching beyond the immediate details, to find the context and to make sure you understand what your research is revealing.
Hello.
Sorry, we're just having some
It's on this corner. So as historians, Imogen and I enjoy turning pieces of the historical jigsaw puzzle this way and that, trying to piece together stories of people and events in the past. We know that many family historians too enjoy searching the archives for sources and information about their ancestors. Sometimes though, we all come across a piece of information in our sources that really just doesn't seem to fit, that we can't make any sense of with what we already know. Or sometimes we come across information about our ancestors, about what our ancestors have done, that seems unlikely or even incredible, beyond belief or beyond our understanding. What do we do then? In this talk, Imogen and I would like to share with you some thoughts about the importance of understanding context and circumstance when researching and writing family history. We'll draw on examples from our own research. Mine research focuses on multicultural families in colonial and early 20th century Australia, and Imogen's work is on the practicalities of everyday life in a colony. Understanding the broad context and particular circumstance of the past can enrich our family history research and the stories that we can tell. So what do we mean by context and circumstance? Historical context is the broad social, economic, legal, cultural, political, religious and environmental background to the lives of our ancestors. It relates to things such as when and where they lived, their social class, their religion, and their race, ethnicity or language group. For example, the marriage laws or customs in place at the time a couple was married, affecting how and when they might have married, but also the records that remain that document that marriage. Circumstance relates more to the small details of everyday lives, who our ancestors met and mixed with, the neighbourhood they lived in, their workplace, and the everyday events that might have prompted them to take one path in life rather than another. And an example is the events that might have led to a woman being introduced to the man she would later marry when they were in a dance together. So, are you doing this bit or am I? I'll do this bit.
You're doing that.
I'm doing this bit? All right. So understanding the historical context can help us understand why and how events in the past unfolded in the way that they did. Context can provide us with a larger picture of our ancestors' lives and a fuller picture of events beyond names and dates in a family tree. Context can help us with understanding why our ancestors might have done what they did. It can help us with empathising with the actions of our ancestors, particularly if they behaved in ways that we might find challenging or a bit puzzling. For example, a woman giving up her children for adoption, or a returned serviceman husband deserting his family. Context can also help us with knowledge of how and why historical records were created and kept or destroyed. And it can also help us with information to analyse and interpret historical records better. And ultimately, I think this can all help us with those what the moments. I keep forgetting what my bits are. So our lives and the lives of our ancestors have always been lived within distinct legal contexts. And so legal context is the first example of historical context that we're going to talk about today. So today, we all know Australia is a nation made up of states and territories, and the laws that govern our lives are created and administered by federal, state, territory and local government authorities. 150 years ago, of course, these systems of government didn't exist, and many of the laws that we live by today also didn't exist. If we look outside of Australia, outside of the British Commonwealth and the British Empire, systems of government and law and administration are even more diverse. So this might seem like an obvious thing to say, but understanding the legal contexts in which our ancestors lived is important in understanding information we find in sources as well as the sources themselves. So being aware of the laws that governed our ancestors' lives can help us to understand what might have happened to them in their lives and why. For example, thousands of Chinese migrants who came to the Australasian colonies over the late 19th century became naturalised British subjects, as did migrants from other countries beyond the British Empire, such as Germans and Americans. But the laws by which migrants could become naturalised differed between the colonies, and then they changed again after Federation. Certain groups, like Chinese, faced different regulations from other migrant groups too. But again, this differed according to place and time. In New South Wales, for example, Chinese were prohibited from naturalisation by law between 1862 and 1867, and then again from 1888. While here in Tasmania, Chinese continued to be naturalised until the Federal Naturalisation Act came into force in 1904. So understanding the changing legal context can also help us understand why our ancestors might have done things that today seem unlikely, like marrying bigamously, or taking on a different name or identity, or providing wrong information on an official document. Personal identification documents like driver's licences and passports were 20th century inventions, and before these existed, it was much easier to become someone else or to take on a new identity when you moved or migrated.
So it's also important to understand, to think about what the systems are that they're working in. So one of the areas that I look at quite a bit are land grants, and people often ask me how their convict ancestor ended up with a land grant. Now, some people assume that that was because they were really good, that it was a reward for good behaviour. But actually there was a policy that drove that allocation until about 1820. And that was when land grants were given to everyone. The size varied according to what kind of a settler you were, but it was a very practical system that had its roots in making sure that the colony was well supplied. They had to grow and feed back into the commissariat stores. But what you also see is that convicts were generally put together on the land, and so you can often assume that their neighbours were also convicts. And that's, we'll come on to bureaucratic contexts a little later in this talk, and this ties into that, but thinking about what the system was that they were getting their land under is a really useful way to understand more about their lives and the choices that they made and how they ended up where they ended up. So it's useful to look at the history of a town or a settlement to get a sense of how it was operating when your subject moved there. Likewise, think about the land policies of the time. So perhaps you have an ancestor who received a soldier settlement grant. Now often these were on poor land, they had very poor resources, and in some of those instances they had very low rates of success. Now this in turn could explain why a family might move several times, why they might have a health record that suggests poverty and poor nutrition, or it might even have contributed to someone's suicide at the time. So thinking about what that legal and political and policy structure that they're moving within, thinking about the impact that had on their lives.
So the next sort of context that we'd like to bring your attention to are social and moral contexts. So as historians, we study how society has changed over time. And for me, that is really one of the most fascinating things about understanding about how people live their everyday lives and the societies in which they lived. I also sometimes imagine what my life might have been like if I lived in a different place and a different time. But as we study the lives of our ancestors in the past, we need to understand them on their own terms and not make assumptions based on our own understandings of the past, our own understandings of morality in the past, or indeed our own contemporary morality. I think one of the ways in which we can sometimes reflect back on the past in slightly anachronistic ways is thinking about family structures. Thinking about things like common law marriages, pregnancy before marriage, illegitimacy and adoption practices. All of these things could be very local. There are parts of the United Kingdom, for example, where women were actually encouraged to have at least one child before marriage to prove that they were able to bear children, for example. It's also dependent on where your ancestors are from and the period of time and their religious and cultural background. My own work is in Chinese Australian history, and in southern China, the part of China where most migrants came from during the 19th century, adoption was a very common practice within families to carry on patrilineal lines. So it didn't have the same meanings that it would have had in a British Australian family. When we look at our sources too, it's also really important to understand the social and moral contexts in which they were created. Sometimes we come across confronting stories or offensive language that is used in reference to our ancestors. Sometimes we come across information that is distressing and a new revelation. Sometimes there are stories that include facts that we know for certain are wrong. So understanding the context in which a source was created can also help us reconcile what we are reading. And that's not necessarily to forgive it for its racism or it's sexism or it's sensationalism, but it's to help us understand as historians. So for example, knowing that a newspaper article like this one came from the salacious scandal sheet The Truth, we can use our judgment to decide on how much weight we might place on it as a source of reliable information about our ancestors.
One of the first things I often get my students to do when they're stuck on a question is to look at a map. It might be an old map, it might be a new map, it might be of the surrounds of their ancestors' lives, or it might be of the town as it is today. Now, there are a number of reasons that this is, I think, a really useful place to start, and I'm going to share just a few of those to once again help place those ancestors' lives within a physical context. Now, there are quite a few useful tools, some fantastic blogs that will help you get the most out of your research using maps. I'm very happy to talk about specifics at the end of the talk if I don't cover something that you are interested in. Now, sometimes looking at a map is just an exercise in interest. It's getting a feel for the place when your ancestors were there. I've got a long history of ancestors from Aalsmeer in the Netherlands, and last year I visited this commuter town to see the house where my father was born. Having spent some time looking through historic maps, both before and after my visit, helped me see the landscape and imagine the generations of Wegmans who had passed through those streets. Now, at the moment we can't travel, but we can explore places through Google Street View, through historic ordnance survey maps, through digitised archival collections, and all sorts of other places. It's the next best thing to being able to go to a place to get a feel for it. Now, when you're looking at these historic maps, think about what kind of an area it is. Is it an industrial town? Is it a small country village? What seem to be things that are large industries in that area? So what might your ancestors have done? Was their profession common? Or can you only see one bootmaker shop in the town centre? Where might they have gone to school as a child? What kind of environment were they in? Was there a lot of greenery, a lot of fresh flowing water, or was it somewhere that was very urban, built up, probably very polluted? You can also think about larger statistics. You might have a sudden gap in your record when in one census there are 6 children in the family aged under 10. In the next census there are 2 children and they can't possibly have all been married. So what's happened to those 4 children? Was there a smallpox epidemic that went through that town, or some other disease? Is there a reason related to the place that you can find? My parents should probably have been warned before I took this job that teaching family history means I just use their family history all the time. So Dad is here today. Dad, here's where all of your ancestors were born. So you can map your own people very easily. On Google, it's pretty straightforward to do. You can create an Excel spreadsheet, click a button, and it will appear in Google as points of interest. Now, this can help you see the patterns, the clusters. This is a very basic map, but it shows the birthplaces going back a few generations, sort of on one side. What you can't see here are how many people came from the same town because the pins are all overlapping and on top of each other. But that can give you a clue about the types of families that are shown here. They're families that weren't very mobile. They tended to marry within their own area. And of course, for many centuries, that has been very normal, that type of family patterns. And so if you don't know where someone came from, if you don't know how they came to be in the family, it can be helpful to look for these patterns. Did the family have a habit of marrying from the close villages? So that might help narrow your search, to look in those close villages for this mysterious woman who married into the family. So they're just tools that can help you refine your search a little. Now, another issue that often comes up is that place names and boundaries change over time. Parishes and villages have a tendency to grow, shrink, or disappear entirely. And local registration districts all do the same. This is a fairly normal part of how I think almost all societies work. So in one example, there was a reorganisation of Van Diemen's Land into counties, hundreds and parishes. And I'm not expecting you to read all the text, there won't be a quiz after. In fact, it's actually missing part of the story up there. So this reorganisation into counties, hundreds and parishes was announced in the mid-1820s, but it took until 1836 to actually be completed. Now, this was at the same time as a lot of expansion. A lot of free settlers were coming to Van Diemen's Land and claiming land. There was also a reorganisation of land granting practices. So we get a lot of records where someone is listed as being in A, but they can't be found on any maps of that place. Now, they might not be there because they might have informally or formally swapped their land or sold it and moved somewhere else. There might have been a name change of that place, or the map or the record could be wrong. And so it doesn't mean that they didn't have that land somewhere, but it was possibly not where you would expect to find it. And so, as I've said before, you're going to need to think about what system they were operating under. And I think that everything that Kate and I are suggesting today means that you need to read around the time. You need to read general texts that give you an overview of the history of a place in a time. Another complication in the records is that place names could move around or be duplicated. So here we have a lovely map of 1828 Van Diemen's Land by Sydney Hall with the enormous Macquarie Harbour. I love this map. Apparently it was printed for school textbooks and they realised very quickly that there was a mistake, but it had already been printed. So I'm told that there's like hundreds of copies out there, but it's quite a fun, as a map nerd, it's quite a fun cartographical little source. Anyway, so on this map in 1828, you have the district of Sorell over on the west there, and Sorell Plains. Now, just 10 years later, you have the same area, this time called Loreni. And so by now, Macquarie Town has been renamed Hamilton. And so when you find a record from about 1835, you might find someone who is listed as having land in Sorell. And that could be this Sorell, or it could be the Sorell that we all know out past the airport, because both of those were in existence. There were two Sorells in Tasmania for a couple of decades. In Britain, quite a few villages have disappeared over the years, and so you might find a place name that isn't on any modern maps. But it's always worth Googling what you do know. Google the place name and the county or the district or the parish or the state, and you might need to add in the century. If it's quite a common name, then try searching for it with something like disappeared or vanished or ghost town, and that will start to bring out those stories of those towns that once were but are no more. Now, the other point there is that you might find a record of someone who is baptised in a different parish from all of their siblings. Again, go and look at a map. Are those two parishes next to each other? If they're on opposite sides of the country, that says that perhaps they moved. But if they're next door to each other, then that might suggest that they liked the priest who was next door more, or that they had just moved across a parish line. That there's a much smaller shift that's happened to make that happen, or again, those parish boundaries might have shifted. So that's where looking at that map for that can be really useful to see the relationship between the different places on those records. Now finally, and this leads into our next context, be aware of the circumstances that a source was made in. Now, place names were often written on records phonetically by someone who didn't know the place. So here we have somewhere that to look at you might think was Happysburg. It's a very happy place, perhaps, except that it's all falling into the ocean today, but anyway. But if you were looking at a record, you might find it spelt something like that because it's pronounced Haysborough. And so that's going to complicate things. I've had quite a few records where I've had to try and put on a really bad accent to try and work out what they're talking about. I've had to put the name in and hope that Google can work out what I'm trying to say. I've had to tweet out, can someone tell me what this place is actually, how it's actually spelt? Because you get these places that are just mysterious spellings. And the same comes with names, place names, people's names, everything that can vary from person to person. And the other aspect of this is that sometimes we can find ancestors that are recorded with several different birthplaces for the one person. And the question that you want to ask there is, why might someone be recorded as being born in Londonderry in one place and London in another? Is that a typo? Was it an accidental abbreviation? And the question you want to ask there is, what question are they answering? Are they answering where are you from? In which case they might say, well, I currently and have lived in London for 20 years, so I am from London, even though I was born in Londonderry. But they're saying that they're from London now. Might be that they're trying to hide some Irish origins. It might just be that the person writing it was lazy, or that the end of the answer's been ripped off, or there's all sorts of reasons for that. And so thinking broadly and trying to think outside the box when you come to those. So when we find documents in archives or on ancestry.com, it's important to think about how the record was created and what the purpose of that record was. This will help you pull out clues that aren't immediately obvious. And it can also help you to use the record for purposes that it wasn't intended to be used for. So a census record will show you who wasn't in a house on census night as well as who was. Recording absence was not the purpose of the census, but we can read those details into that gap. Perhaps someone was married by that date and had moved out, or perhaps they had died by that date and had moved out. So that tells you something about those dynamics again. Now, as they say, an absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Records often have been destroyed by accident, by age, by intent. For example, in Ireland, I'm sure that anyone who has tried to research Irish ancestry will come across that problematic destruction by fire, accidental fire of thousands and thousands and thousands of records in 1922. I think it was 1922 when they all just went up in flames. And so we have to think creatively around those. But just because a record doesn't exist doesn't mean that the person didn't exist or that the information wasn't there. It just means that we can't find a specific piece of information. At the end of wars, records often get destroyed. And so we don't know who lived, who died. People changed their names when they were resistance operatives. They would go under pseudonyms. So these are all things that we need to think about. Why might there be that gap in the record? It might be to do with how the record was created, how it was used, or another element in the record's life. And likewise, thinking about what was intended with that record. Why were they telling the information to the recording officer? So when someone emigrated to Australia, they would usually need to record what their occupation was. Now, at certain times in Australia's history, we've had depressions, droughts, all sorts of different things that mean that someone who had a niche specialisation, perhaps they were I can't think of any specialisations at the moment. Anyway, a really specialised job that wouldn't be in need. So they might have just said, I'm a labourer, because they were hoping that that would get them into the country, that would actually give them more of a chance of getting a job when the job market was tight. And I will pass over.
So, in previous life, before I joined UTAS, and a long time ago now, I worked at the National Archives in Canberra. And one of the things that I've spent a lot of time, both in my work at the National Archives and in my own research, is trying to unpick the records that were created under the administration of the Immigration Restriction Act. So the Immigration Restriction Act was the legislative backbone of the White Australia policy. And so when I started my doctoral research a very long time ago, looking at mixed race Chinese Australian families in colonial Australia, I came to the archives looking for stories of these families. And what I found there were thousands and thousands and thousands of documents created by the government about the travels of Chinese Australians in and out of the country over the first half of the 20th century. And among the records that I found were ones like this one. And this is actually the back of a birth certificate. And it's of a man named Ormond Atkinson, who was born in Paddington in Sydney in 1897. And Ormond Atkinson, I don't have the other side of the birth certificate for you, but he was illegitimate, and his mother was white. Her name was Marion Atkinson. So I don't actually know who his father was. But this document was in the archives because Ormond travelled overseas just around the beginning of First World War. So 1913, I think it was 1915 was the second trip he made. And so he, as someone who was classified as coloured, as not white, his travel in and out of the country was restricted. And so he used this birth certificate as evidence of his Australian birth and his right to return to Australia. So you wouldn't generally expect a birth certificate to turn up in an archive about immigration and about travel. And for me, these records, they tell a story that I didn't expect to find in those records. I thought the records about the White Australia policy were about migrants, but most of these records are actually about Australians who were travelling overseas. And so understanding the context in which these records were created and why and how the bureaucracy of White Australia functioned is really important to understanding what these documents are. So you can see on this particular document, it has his handprint and it has his photographs that were put there so that he could be certainly identified when he returned to Australia. And you can also see annotations noting when he landed back into the country.
So our final thought for today on understanding historic bureaucratic wrangling comes with a very practical application. So both of us find making timelines very useful to try and organise our evidence and to see how it all fits together. But this can involve a lot of different documents, and some of those won't have names or dates. And they might turn out to be crucial pieces in that puzzle, in placing a person in a certain place at a certain time, or even proving that they were alive. So trying to pinpoint them on that timeline can be very important. Now, I'm going to use an example here of mapping because I'm a map person, but the principles apply to all sorts of different documents here. Early early maps didn't always have a surveyor named or a date on them. Now this Hobart map is actually very useful, but there's very little detail about it. It is part of a set that has all sorts of interesting things in it. Can recommend having a little look through there. Now, when I first looked at this map, I couldn't find the key anywhere. So what you can't quite see there is that it's got blocks with numbers in them. It's theoretically showing you who is in each of those properties along those streets. Now, I went and I checked the back of the map in case it hadn't been photographed. I looked to see if there was an extra sheet that hadn't been captured, but there was nothing in the actual physical vault back behind us all. But there's some very familiar features on this map. I couldn't quite place them, but I knew that I recognised the handwriting and that cartouche, and the style was very familiar. And then I remembered one of my favourite maps, because it's just so beautiful, this one. So William Sharland loved to write in a flourishing hand. Now, he did this map just as he arrived in the colony, before he started working for the survey office. So I was pretty sure that he is the one who has drafted this map, because he was employed privately to make it. And again, you can see there's that lovely cartouche of the thing and the what's it up in the top corner. It's a bit late in the week, I'm forgetting all my words. You've got the lovely script down with the Lower Newtown. It's a very distinctive style, and also up in the top. So this one was 1823. Now this one here is from 1847, so from 1823 to 1847 is a long time. So we know that that Hobart map was done by Sharland because it's got the same decorative features, but that's quite a long period of time in the records. There's a lot of documentation that that map could connect to. So it's useful. We've narrowed it slightly to his name. But on this one, and you might not be able to quite see the detail, especially not when it's blurry slightly, but you can see the font of Angus Rivulet up the top. And again, I could compare that to the street names that were on that Hobart map and see that he was doing his G's and his A's in a very similar style, that is very consistent in how he labels his maps. But there's a caution here, because you can also see that granted to Angus Bethune at the bottom has been added in later. It's a different handwriting. And in fact, Sharland's original comment has been crossed out. You might not be able to quite make out. It's been crossed out, you can trust me on that. And someone later on has corrected it. So you don't want to assume that the name on the map is the person who drafted it, and that's the same for any document, that if there is a name on there, and if it's really important for you to connect that document to that name, be aware that it might not be the same. So here we have another of Sharland's maps, but this one was copied from an original by Sharland. So, and this one, the handwriting is still beautiful, but it's someone else's style. And I haven't quite worked out who this one is yet, but it's another distinctive handwriting. So, and if we look at this map, we can see that it's actually fairly early Hobart, because it doesn't go as far as the 1840 Sprent map. Hobart stretches out a lot further when you compare the two, sort of the street layout. And so we've worked out, see that lovely, the way he writes his titles. I really enjoyed his handwriting for those ones, or the print that he uses. So we've worked out that this is an earlier map made by Sharland. And so I could then go and actually look in the records and find this list. And once again, you can see those dots in his letters and the way that he has written it, and again by comparing it. And so I can see that that map was made in 1840. tell you who lived or possessed which blocks on which streets in 1827, which, as I'm sure you can all appreciate, is actually quite interesting and useful knowledge. So my spare time project at the moment is connecting this list to the original map, but it's taking a little while because I don't have very much spare time. Just as an example for how you think about approaching finding a name and a date, looking at, are there other documents that are written in the same handwriting, have a name on them, have a date on them, that can actually help you refine that and help you fit it into your timeline a little bit better. So, context helps us fill in those gaps. How do you know what you don't know? And that's the big question to ask when you're doing this kind of research. You think you've got a full story until you start to look at it closer, and then you start to find the gaps. So how do you look closer? You can create a timeline and work out where are the gaps in the chronology. Where do they fall off the radar for 20 years? And then you can think about that 20 years. You can write a basic biography, and what stands out as missing in that? What are your sticky notes on it that you're constantly just scratching your head, that you keep on coming back to, wondering about? Or you can write or imagine a fictional description or a scene. And what bits of the story do you need to go and look up? What do you need to go and investigate further so that you can create this fictional account? So they're just ideas for you, and Kate is going to talk a little bit more about some more specifics.
Okay, so before we finish up, we'll just have a think about how do we find all this context that Imogen and I have been talking about. So I think the first thing is to be curious and to ask questions. Ask questions of your sources and ask questions of the information that you're finding in those sources. You can read widely and broadly about the time period and the place. You can also read closely and follow the leads that you find in your sources, like Imogen was talking about with her maps. Really interrogate the details, the curious squiggles, the numbering that you find on documents. You can go and see the places for yourself, if you can. Not at the moment, although you can do that virtually online. But going to see a place, to walk in the streets, to looking at the architecture, the houses, that can really give you a strong sense of what a place was like in the past. You can talk to your family. You can talk to libraries and archive staff. And if you do get to go to the place where your ancestors were, talk to the locals. I sometimes find popping into the local historical society or even the Tourist Information Bureau and just asking some pertinent questions can get you a long way. You can attend talks and webinars and conferences like this one, or you can come and study with us at UTAS. So now for my little bit of promotion. So for the Diploma of Family History, which Imogen and I both teach into at UTAS, we're changing the program a little bit for next year, so you're getting a bit of a sneak peek. So from next year, you study eight units, and those are 4 foundation level units and 4 introductory level units, and we're changing the units up a little bit next year. Previously, we've had 2 convict units, and from next year, we're going to be introducing a new unit on migration. So the new Migrant Families unit, which I'll be running, is looking at Australian migration to and from Australia and New Zealand, kind of over the 19th and 20th centuries, and thinking about all the ways that people came and went from Australia, and thinking about some of our multicultural communities as well.
But we will still have 1 convict unit.
So we have 1 convict unit in sort of the foundation level, and then the families at war and migrant families units at the introductory level as well. So that's where we're going to leave it for today, and we're very happy to take your questions and comments and hope for a bit of discussion. Thank you.